Whether you operate one forklift or thousands, one location or hundreds, the new My Toyota customer portal can help you optimize your operation and material handling equipment. This one-stop, free-to-use platform is designed to help you take control of your information and make smarter decisions, all at the touch of a button. Register and access your data today at my.toyotaforklift.com. That's my.toyotaforklift.com. Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Justin Griffith of Stay Linked and David Krebs of VDC Research. In part 1, we dove into their research study, Making Supply Chain Resilience Work, Keeping Up with Ever-Demanding Warehouse Operations. And we discussed supply chain resilience in today's landscape, what's important to the customer experience now, and how that has changed over the last few years, and the importance of foundational systems in order to adopt newer technologies in your operation. In part 2, we will dive into how technology is being leveraged to gain more productivity out of existing labor, and what technologies are top of mind for operations decision makers right now. So I hope you enjoyed part 2, and I hope you enjoyed part 1 as well. If you missed it, be sure to check it out. It's the previous episode to this, and now we will get into the remainder of our conversation.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
I think as we see a lot of these new technologies come into the market and come into play, a lot of it is focused on around, how do we increase productivity of a worker? How do we, get more out of one worker? Because there's certainly challenges in the market with, getting people that want to work in a warehouse environment at this point, right? So tell us a little bit about kind of the importance of considering that human factor when it comes to investing in technology within the warehouse space.
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive point. And, again, this has been an area that we as an organization have studied over many years, is sort of, again, that alignment of frontline mobile worker with, whatever mobile or digital solution. And, I will say by and large, the frontline worker has largely gone, I would say underserved, but certainly it hasn't been a priority when thinking about, a lot of technology investments. And by that, I mean, again, going back to that, set it and forget it, sweat the asset type. And when looking at some of the mobile solutions that are still in use today, that are still so super sort of text heavy and someone who's been using it for many years, okay, it might be second nature to them, but put that into the hands of someone who's onboarding. I mean, it'll take them a good couple of weeks, if not more, to get familiar or comfortable with that process. So the worker experience is certainly it's a massive opportunity as well as a requirement. Labor is central to warehouse operations. It's not going away. I mean, certainly there have been investments and continue to be investments in automation, but it's really about, I would say, alignment with sort of labor-centric processes as opposed to necessarily completely, displacing them. So what does that mean? From our perspective, it's really about making almost the technology as invisible as possible. And a lot of these workers, they rely on the need to use their hands, to use their eyes, to do their jobs. And to do their jobs also, I mean, these are, you're on your feet for the entire day, and they're not easy jobs. And you have to think about safety, you have to think about fatigue. So ergonomics come into play. Obviously, again, even things like hygiene and safety when thinking about, wearable technologies. So all of those are, I think, very important elements when thinking about, the right sort of technology for that mobile worker. There's not going to be a one size fits all for any warehouse solution. It's going to be very dependent. So you do see a lot of need for some level of multifunctionality, if you will, or multimodal sort of capabilities. But again, something that can be seamlessly integrated and doesn't require a lot of looking at the screen, punching in, information. So taking advantage of, advances that we've seen around sort of more ergonomic wearable solutions, maybe simplifying some of the steps and processes. And we do see, I think, an opportunity to really rethink also at this point, sort of the worker machine interface and what that means moving forward to, when we have, in warehouse environments with, perhaps sort of AMRs running around and sort of AI driven sort of intelligence that you can, sort of use that to orchestrate between the worker and the labor, as well as, what's being automated. So I think that there's an opportunity to rethink that man-machine interface as well as we're looking at, sort of warehouse operations. But it really comes down to, this is a workforce where you do see a lot of turnover. It's a workforce where you do see a lot of seasonality. So if you're giving them the technology to use, it needs to be intuitive. The onboarding needs to be, obviously as quick as possible. It needs to be safe. It needs to be comfortable, and it needs to, sort of align as best possible with that workflow to provide that greatest, productivity. Because at the end of the day, it is a task-driven, repetitive, workflow-driven, job whose success is a function of speed and accuracy. So I think that those are certainly some of the elements that our organizations need to take into consideration as they're making these investments.
Interesting. Yeah. Justin, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it was interesting, during the pandemic, right, there was a big push because, even keeping a warehouse open was a huge risk, especially in the early days. And I thought it was interesting that we started looking at the other end of the spectrum. For a while, it was kind of all about the new and emerging workforce coming in and seeing this text-based workflow or something, and them just passing out, having a look at this, right? But that user experience be so terrible that it would drive the new workforce away. And I thought it was probably healthy. I think that, COVID had us looking at, okay, if you had an older workforce, they were higher at risk, right? And so you couldn't have these warehouses. And for all of the technology that was available to everyone, for all the beacons and sensors and AMRs and drones and RFID and Bluetooth, if you didn't have people, you weren't operating.
Yeah.
And I think we're still very much in that position. I think that's sort of what came to light during that whole pursuit. There was a lot of focus on automation. There was a lot of narrative of there's no hope at the end of this of getting a bunch of new workers into the workforce here. So we're going to replace it with bots. And then the bots were kind of more, I think, difficult for people to consume than I think they initially thought, right? And then it did refocus kind of everybody back on the workforce that they had and sort of the workflows that they were using today. And I think that was a really healthy exercise because, like David was saying, I think it opened up a lot more low-hanging fruit kind of successes that could be had versus going all in on any one tech. There were stepping stones that they could take where they could, plug in bots to handle travel, so you weren't sending a workforce across a warehouse multiple times a day, walking, picking stuff to shipping or things like that. I think it also opened people up to the consciousness of, okay, we don't have to go full automation. We could also do remote piloting, so we don't have to have sort of these fully autonomous systems in there. We could actually have people interacting with these bots remotely and get a high degree of accuracy that way without having to do a huge investment in very, very, very intelligent bots. And you gain access to more of a workforce that way. So I think it's been really interesting how the narrative around a lot of the technologies where it had been, a swap or replacement, it is definitely about how do we integrate these two things? How do we get robots and our workforce working in concert to get a better result?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so interesting to see that. I'm glad you guys kind of pointed that out, and that observation about, how it called out that human factor is still very much essential, right, to what we're doing within the warehouse. I mean, I think, you think back maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, around that time, like there was huge discussion, right, around the dark warehouse, lights out warehouse, right? And, you don't see that much about that anymore, right, at this point. So I think, to your points there, that, there was that point where it was like, like we still actually really need people to do this. And a lot of the technology has evolved, and I think, like you mentioned there, Justin, you kind of focused on that human element still, but how do we make these humans, these workers, have a better work experience, make them more productive, take away things that, like you said, pushing the cart that they don't want to do, that's going to like slow them down, that's going to reduce productivity and is not really necessarily a value add to what they're providing from a human element, right? So it's very interesting to see that. And I think additionally, kind of along the same lines, we saw in the study there mentioned that there's been a huge shift towards devices and having they become more Android based when it comes to, the handhelds or the wearables that are being utilized in warehouse operations. So I'm curious from your perspectives, like, why is this shift happening and how does it kind of overall impact the user experience itself when they're operating in the warehouse or interacting with this tech?
We'll be back after a quick break.
You hear a lot about supply chains these days because if the past couple years have taught us anything, it's that an efficient, well-managed supply chain is absolutely critical to keeping businesses successful and consumers happy. I'm Will Haywood and I host a podcast called All Business, No Boundaries, where we talk about supply chains, how they work, what happens when they don't, and the innovations that are redefining what's possible in the world of logistics. Join me for insightful interviews with thought leaders and industry experts. We discuss how optimizing supply chains can break down the barriers that are holding businesses back. That's All Business, No Boundaries by DHL Supply Chain. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, so I'll go first and I'll say that I don't think anyone wanted the shift to Android. I don't think this was, I don't think that anyone, at least from the tech vendor community as well, probably also from certainly also from the practitioner decision maker community, it was a sort of a necessary requirement with Microsoft largely exiting the small form factor space. Historically for these types of devices, a, Windows CE embedded Windows platform was sort of the de facto, was the primary platform used for these products. With that being end of life, there was a gap, and that gap was filled by Android. So, I think there's, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I think, with Android, certainly we've seen a really nice evolution of the mobile solutions to certainly become more similar to sort of everyday consumer technology in terms of design, ergonomics, and obviously the user interface and sort of just the general intuitiveness, of the mobile device, of the mobile solution in logistics environments. And I think the logistics space has been one of the last areas for that transition to happen. Certainly saw that, start much more around sort of what you would consider or what we would consider a consumer facing workflow, such as a delivery or a retail environment. But certainly in the warehouse environment was had to evolve as well, just because the legacy technology was going end of life and just became a security risk because it was no longer being supported. And again, it offered the opportunity to sort of modernize and to sort of dust off a little bit, a lot of these legacy sort of applications and sort of approaches to interfaces. So introducing, sort of images and graphics-based interfaces, migrating away from these text-heavy sort of green screen type of applications is certainly, sort of a transition that we've seen. Certainly the devices themselves have become much more powerful. And so what we've seen, again, probably a little less so in the warehouse, more so outside, but a proliferation of the number of applications that workers are using has also expanded. So, whereas, before it was 1 or 2 apps per se, and now it's, or at least our research is suggesting it's, closer to 3, 4, maybe 5 apps per worker, per, traditional workflow. So I think that certainly has happened, but it is, just the pace of change of Android, the upgrade cycle, and sort of that constant merry-go-round is a real challenge for, really everyone. And so as a result, we've seen, I would say, much greater emphasis and focus around security and security compliance, and it being also a roadblock in many ways to some technology sort of opportunities because it doesn't pass, sort of security compliance requirements. So I think the emphasis around security has become and necessary, I for sure, but as a result of just sort of managing Android. And with Android, unfortunately, again, based on its pace of change, now you're seeing a lot of fragmentation in terms of, the vendors are managing this as an enterprise platform. So they are providing lifecycle support, past the year, for 3 years past sort of, end of life of the device. So end of support will extend. So they're trying to provide the tools so that, we don't need to replace these devices every 24 or 36 months. But it still is creating I would say, a more challenging environment as well as I would say, providing a more multifunctional, more powerful, a more, sort of intuitive and sort of well-designed user experience. So, a little bit of both when it comes to Android, but it is the de facto now. I mean, it's for any mobile wearable. I mean, you certainly have seen a smattering perhaps of iOS and Windows still see on like large display devices, so tablets and maybe forklift computers. We're certainly seeing some use of Windows, but Android is for any type of mobile interface has become sort of the platform of choice. Mm.
Yeah, it was not so much a choice as a lack of options, right? They definitely, and this definitely came down to the OS providers. This market as a whole is the flea on the back of the consumer grade market. And so, when Windows exited that market following, the Windows 8 and Windows 10 sort of push where they were going to do a unified OS and you could write one app and that app could run on your mobile device or it could run on your computer or it could run on your Xbox or whatever. When that didn't flesh out, it kind of became clear that Android had the most open ecosystem for consuming this market. Yeah. Right. And so it's good in one way because Android, it's like there's endless possibilities for what it could do for you and what it could do to you. Right. And that, when Android first hit the market, a lot of the migration storyline was you have to move as Windows is going end of life. And what we found initially was that just because you have to do something does not mean you're going to do it. Right. We found that when Android first hit the market, it's the same technology adoption storyline we saw with every other technology storyline. What we found was that the attempt to migrate to Android was at the same time paired with, like what David was saying, while we're at it, let's modernize the user experience, right? And those two things had to happen in concert. If you wanted to start using your Android devices, you had to modernize the interface so that you could use the touchscreen. We had kind of a unique perspective on this because we make a terminal emulator. Right. And that's obviously very text-based, right? That's very text-heavy. Mm-hmm. And when Android came out, there was all this potential. It's a touchscreen OS, but that's a 55-year-old technology, terminal emulation. And for 55 years, it's been driven by a keyboard. And the one thing that Android got rid of was a keyboard. Yeah. And so there was this big lurch of people trying to move to the new devices. But then, there was sort of this attempt, okay, how am I going to do what I'm doing today as good or better now that I'm moving to Android? And I think that's one of the demarcation lines we use when we look at technology is that barrier of viability to say, can this technology, this device, this whatever, do the same job I'm doing today as good or better than what I'm using today? And if you cross that barrier, you're good to go. Your project is greenlit, right? Because that's the floor now. It's going to be an improvement, right? And anything else we could get out of that, great. Android took a little while to get there, I think. And even now, there's a huge swath of the market that's they're still sweating their assets, still using Windows device, just waiting it out until the picture gets simpler. And some of the answers that people have been waiting on, they could do this in Windows, and it was a simple answer in Windows, are kind of still waiting on that simple answer for Android. But it's true. When Android was first coming out, it was all about you have to because there's no choice. And people said, oh, yeah, we could keep using our stuff and they don't shut down, right? Yeah. You could keep sweating it. But now the narrative, I think, is really cool because all of the interconnectedness that the OS is capable of is starting to bear fruit. It was stuff that was always available sort of on the consumer market, but now in the industrial space, it's starting to show itself as being a useful platform for getting some of these things to speak to one another. Beacon sensitivity and RFID readers and things that were very difficult to get in Windows now they're just inherent in the OS. And there's an ecosystem that there's now good reason to move to Android. It's not just the scare of your devices going end of life. Now there's actually, you're selling the upside. Here's the upside of going to Android. You have a ton more options. And in this market right now, options are what people are after. So it's kind of been a great time to have a conversation about Android.
Yeah, very interesting perspectives there, and I think it's really interesting to see that too as well. And I think there's something interesting that you kind of threw in there a little bit is that Android is like a touchscreen based OS primarily, right? So I mean, tell us kind of briefly a little bit. I mean, some of your thoughts around the idea that as we look at some of the labor challenges, right, and we look at newer generations as well that have primarily only grown up with screens and touch screens, right? I mean, how does that make a difference potentially when a warehouse operation looks at these wearable devices, handheld devices that are more reminiscent maybe or similar to, that smartphone that, hey, they're plugged into, maybe 22 hours out of 24 hours a day, right? I mean, how does that make a difference for your workforce and keeping your workforce too and recruiting them?
Yeah, but I think there's an aspect of this about, right information, right place, right time, and a certain need for simplification. So we have seen, recently, especially around sort of this wearable discussion, I think, Justin, you may have referenced this earlier, is a little bit of a redefinition of sort of the wearable solution as it pertains to sort of the warehouse worker, the warehouse workflow. And that certainly rests on, in part on the interface and how workers interface with these devices. And so the traditional wearable solution was something that you'd strap to your wrist. It had, it was essentially this. You could have just taken a mobile device and used a strap and some type of a corded or a Bluetooth scanner, attached to that. And it just really was a mimicking what would be a sort of a handheld solution. And those are still prevalent. We starting to see some of those. But I think that there is some, underlying thinking that we can even simplify this further and try to take as much of any type of interaction away from sort of the user. And, a wearable solution that still has an interface and a UI, but is smaller, doesn't have all of the options that a full-fledged mobile computer would have, but is very much aligned with a specific workflow and provides just the necessary information and in a very sort of distilled and easy to follow, easy to use, again, for, some of these workflows that are somewhat repetitive in nature and sort of allow for that and allow for the intelligence in the underlying system as well. That's certainly an important part of that, because, you don't want, sort of this notion of, again, line of sight and line of sight issues becoming a distraction. There are places where you can leverage sort of the intuitive display, the large, the crisp display with images and things of that nature, but, it doesn't always have a place. So I think that it comes back down to, sort of the human factor idea. What is the right technology for that workflow that allows for as much or as seamless an experience, as invisible an experience as possible. And I think we've certainly seen that in some of these newer wearable solutions that are being introduced that are really, trying to sort of, make it as simple and as intuitive and as comfortable. I mean, they're super lightweight, super, you don't even realize you're wearing them most of the time. As opposed to, something that has cords on it and is, somewhat bulky and can get dropped or lost. Or I guess any of these devices can get lost. But I think that that's certainly something that we've seen. These Android solutions are all lockdown solutions, either in kiosk mode or something like that. The workers don't have access to apps or Netflix or something like that. I mean, to provide any other type of distraction. But even having just a large display and having to look at the display multiple times and entering information can be disruptive to the workflow. So I think that level of sort of workflow, sort of innovation, I think is something that we've seen, some interesting development and interesting trends around for sure.
Interesting.
Yeah, wearables are really just a fascinating kind of space in general, because, when for a while, I think when people thought wearables, it was either like David was saying, the sort of wearable strap to the arm. And it's funny because when you go out and do some of the ergonomic studies, they were finding that huge swaths of these customers were actually carrying it around in one hand and then holding the other hand with the scanner kind of thing. And now you weren't free anymore. In fact, both of your hands were now being used to hold this wearable device that was supposed to make you hands-free, or there were things like heads-up display kind of stuff. And that was, I think, healthy in that it did start to push people a little more towards like whatever the next best action, what's the next best step, break it down into individual pieces as opposed to presenting a user with a whole screen of data and 4 or 5 fields and 6 or 7 function keys and all of that. If there's a way to whittle down the workflow to the next best step, people saw the power in that. And even when we talked about kind of the modernization of these workflows and putting, graphics over the top of these more text-based kind of things, that's where a lot of the success was happening, was get rid of the clutter, right? Like if you can get the next best action and get rid of the buttons they could use, because a number of these apps were written in a way where there was one button that could make it work and like 54 buttons that you could totally screw it up with, right?
Yeah.
And so teaching users that became, part of this huge lift for onboarding. But if it's broken down into these next best action kind of things, I think where we saw or where we're seeing a lot of the wins when you don't have a lot of real estate is in sort of these hybrid models, again, sort of the stepping stone to consume the technologies. So even in wearable solutions that are standalone, there has to be a strategy for exception handling because it doesn't always go right. Sometimes you underpick or you overpick, or there's an error coming from the application that you're going to need to clear or put in a lot of data. And if the screen is only 2 inches across, okay, then input is going to be a problem. Yeah. And most of the applications involve some sort of input. So as a hybrid, or working in concert with a device, I think we're seeing a lot of the early success be there, where it's not just all wearable. The wearable has access to keys or access to a keyboard, or it's paired with a device that you jump to when you have an exception, because those are going to happen no matter what. So again, not going all in on the strategy yet. You can get there. The platform is there. The devices are intelligent enough. And if your application is flexible enough, you can get the workflow there. But to consume it quickly for a lot of these wearables, it becomes kind of, okay, get 80% of it onto the screen. And the other 20%, let them jump back to the screen and keyboard, right? It's not, it kind of becomes about what are they doing most of the time and take that win, right? And that's what we're finding in sort of all of these technologies, is that the best chance of success they can to get adopted is if they can be taken in bite-sized chunks, right? And sort of have this continuous, gradual improvement to move to a technology. That tends to be the much more successful strategy in the aggregate across all these technologies.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting insights there. I mean, I think it's pretty interesting to see. And, I think it's a really good point there, Justin, about, seeing, what is the actual actions or tasks that are being repetitively done that should be on those wearables or those handhelds, and focus on that. And then if we got to go back to the traditional desktop or something like that to do the rest, and we can do that. I mean, I think it's interesting to see all the different approaches, I think, too, and form factors around these different technologies as well, which I think makes it interesting to try and figure out which one is going to be best for the worker, and how that's going to work out. There's been a lot of evolution there. I mean, I've certainly seen like you guys mentioned, the worker who's holding the wearable in their hand instead of wearing it, right? And there's a lot of different things that go into that, but it's interesting to see kind of that evolution, how it continues to evolve. So I appreciate the insights on that there. So The other biggest tech kind of in the study I noticed there was around locationing systems, and they kind of were falling into that category of being currently used, and in the evaluation stage, there was growth there as well. So I guess talk to us a little bit about maybe first kind of the defining this locationing systems subject or arena, and then kind of why that's being driven as kind of some of this next biggest tech coming up.
So my take on this is, I mean, first, locationing covers a pretty broad set of technologies, includes everything from, real-time locationing systems to potentially RFID to, some type of GPS-based solution. But fundamentally, what we're seeing is, and I'll give a couple of examples here, but really it's being driven, going back to sort of this undercurrent of visibility and access to real-time, sort of operational insights. And this is, this can be a function as a result of, regulatory factors. So when we're thinking about, pharmaceutical industry or food space and things like, the DSESA or Food Safety Modernization Act is driving, it's driving organizations to have more information on the individual or down to the individual item for a variety of recall and traceability related purposes. So we're moving towards identifying items individually and their individual components, lot number, dates, and a variety of other sort of, identifiers and characteristics. And that will require in many ways a different type of data capture infrastructure to support. Everything from sort of the data identifier itself, as well as how it's being captured, and that will then allow for organizations to to have more visibility into sort of the various elements across their supply chain. So you have these regulatory pressures. A lot of times you also have certain industries have high value or again unique item requirements where you need sort of greater condition-based monitoring that has a location-based aspect as well. So if there's damage that's potentially happening, you want to be able to identify where that damage occurs. Right. So if you're transporting electronic equipment or glass-based equipment into the automotive space, so there's a lot of assets that get damaged across the supply chain, and the need for sort of effective impact monitors or temperature monitors is only going to grow. So those are other sort of examples where we're seeing sort of demand for, again, greater sort of visibility into, some element of locationing capabilities. And then what we're also seeing, again, going back to, I mean, we haven't talked about RFID too much here, but we are seeing RFID enter the sort of the warehouse logistics environment with greater sort of volume and opportunity. And that's coming from a number of angles. Certainly part of it is leveraging sort of the investment in RFID in segments like apparel that's happening today. So there's source tagging of RFID in apparel manufacturing, but those tags aren't really being used until the inventory reaches the retail store, if you will. So we're starting to see organizations leverage those investments in their logistics processes through portal-based sort of reading. So you can have sort of greater real-time visibility as opposed to sort of scanning in individual items as they come into distribution centers and warehouses, as you might think they do. In addition to introducing RFID as a way to eliminate manual scanning, I mean, we see large logistics organizations saying, and when I'm unloading vehicles and parcels that come into a sortation facility, if I can automate that through sort of an RFID-based portal, to eliminate the need for manual scans. I mean, there's a workflow aspect to it, but then also it allows me sort of, I wouldn't say complete transparency, but, to the latest read point, additional level of visibility in terms of the location of those assets as they move through the supply chain. So I think there's a number of different ways to skin it, but I think the underlying driver and requirement is, again, to be able to identify more accurately where assets are across your supply chain. Again, to go back to the initial part of this discussion, is to drive greater agility into your operation so that if you need to make a change sort of quote unquote on the fly, you're able to do so with that, that level of data insight.
Yeah, I think, like Kevin, we've talked about before, the sort of risk aversion of our industry kind of thing to technologies and technology adoption. I think what people are coming around to is looking at getting better information to make decisions with, right? To one, say, what are the problems worth solving, right? Like, do I really have a problem with transport or something, or traversing the warehouse? So do I need AMRs, right? Or could I, path my workers better because I know how they're traversing the warehouse? Can I lay the warehouse out differently and get those same efficiencies that I would have gotten by some other means, right? So some of it is about just better decision making, but it is also one of these things where it is a prerequisite for some of the advancements in technology. You're going to need some level of location data to be able to build on. And so I think location in particular is one of these interesting ones because it underpins a lot of the new technologies coming out. If you have AMRs, you're using a locationing system. Even if you're not tracking the individual items, you're tracking, the bots are tracking and the workers are tracking. And so you've got sort of top level visibility over all of these things. You can make better strategic decisions, see where the small wins can be had. And more importantly, if you make an investment or you pilot a new technology, you can see if it helped, right? Because you could try a technology, and if the data doesn't back it up, it's like, well, that went terribly for us. Let's not invest any more in that, right? So I think that is what's fueling a lot of this. Is it's one of those technologies that again feeds options. It's a good investment because it feeds better visibility and enables technology discussions with more certainty. So it helps put the risk aversion just a little bit at bay. The more you know, right? The more you know about what you have and where it is and all of that. I think that's honestly what's driving it more than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such a great point there on the visibility overall that it's going to give you and allow you to, maybe as David mentioned, something damages in transit, you can better pinpoint where did that damage happen. And, do we have an issue there with that, whether it's a packaging issue or maybe it's a certain transport carrier, that's a reoccurring issue or something like that. It's getting down to that kind of root cause and understanding of where those problems and as you said, Justin, maybe where those successes too on what's working as we implement this technology. And I think it was interesting too, as you pointed out there, that a lot of the technologies that are coming out are dependent on that locationing and being able to know where that thing is. I mean, if you have I think that's some of the difference there between like a robot and a human, right? If somebody puts something one bin over in a shelf by accident instead of the other one, the robot's going to go to that bin and the robot's not going to look left or right and see is it over there, right? So, it becomes more and more important to be able to leverage those. The robot's just going to say, no, it's not here. I'm done, right? I'm gone, right? And so, I think that's more and more important to be able to bring that into play. And I think it goes back to even the accuracy level too. We were talking about the importance of accuracy on the rise and, knowing where your product is, whether it's, in the warehouse somewhere or whether it's, in transit and having that additional visibility through these different locationing technologies is giving you that better accuracy on where does it lie, how much do I have, and where is it in terms of getting to that consumer overall, and is it on time right now? And if it's not, like Justin, you mentioned, kind of getting to that root cause of what's happening and seeing this data overall on a bigger scale and really understanding where those opportunities and where those problems lying at. So very, very interesting stuff here with both you, Justin and David, and this report kind of diving into some of this technology within the warehousing space and really having an understanding of where decision makers are in their heads in the space and how those things are changing over time is really interesting to dive into the report and see these trends. So I appreciate you both for joining me today to discuss this. Very robust discussion, a lot of great insights and takeaways here. If people are interested in learning more about Stay Linked, Justin, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, just reach out to us at staylinked.com or send an email to info@staylinked.
All right, great. And David, how about yourself? What's the best way to get in touch or reach out to VDC?
Yeah, so by our website, there's an option to connect with us there, vdcresearch.com. Otherwise, certainly you can send me over an email directly at davidk@vdcresearch.com.
All right, great. And we'll definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well. And we'll also link to the white paper itself so people can easily access that and get a look at all the data that's driving that and some of the insights that we touched on here today. So Justin and David, thank you once again for joining me.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want more content from the New Warehouse, check out our new video series called All Hands on LinkedIn. Just search for the New Warehouse on LinkedIn and follow along.